now. So welcome everyone to session 3 in today's Organic University. We again have Jeff Schahczenski, who will be talking about accessing those federal programs that can help you make the most of the conservation practices that you're already doing or that you intend to take on. Jeff is a treasure trove of information. He's at the National Center for Appropriate Technology in Butte and readily accessible and great to work with. So if you have any questions after this, please feel free to reach out to him. So take it away, Jeff.
Yeah, I have the lucky job that I actually get paid to answer questions from farmers and ranchers. Isn't that a great deal that is, huh? I really like it. Yeah, I'm going to talk about federal conservation programs. Really, I'm going to talk about two major programs, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. There are other, the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation, you have to watch my acronyms. Conservation Service is a huge, multifaceted, very complicated bureaucracy that is an amazing thing that I have watched for, gosh, almost over 25 years. I was a member of the State Technical Committee when I arrived in Montana almost in the first 4 years, and that was in 1991. I've served on that committee ever since. So I have watched conservation programs change nationally and in the state for many years, and I can tell some very funny and sometimes sad stories, sometimes happy ones. And everything I say today, you can just read in a brand new publication that finally came out. I pushed them to get it out for this very event. And as you can see, it has Doug and Anna Crabtree, who have always been featured in this publication, which I've written now through 3 farm bills, which is about 15 years. And I always put their picture in there. And so they're getting older and they're getting more dogs, it seems too. But anyway, that publication is readily available on our ATRA website. So everything I say is probably easier to understand if you just read it, although it's fairly long. So I'm going to talk about these two. The Environmental Quality Incentive Program is the historically older of these two major, they call them working lands because it's support to adopt practices and systems and sometimes bundles of practices on your farm that enhance broadly conservation, and they're on working lands versus setting aside, riparian a buffer for wildlife. That's something NRCS and FSA even does, but those are kind of taking land out of production, CRP, and for environmental and other benefits. And I'm not talking about those non-working lands. I'm just talking about these. And these are the two majors. It's something like $3.3 billion were allocated last year for these two programs. It's a major part of the NRCS's work. The environment, again, historically it was the ECIP, and that's about practices, practices, practices. There are something like, I never counted them recently, but well over 100 different, very carefully, almost inanely carefully defined conservation practices. A simple one is cover crops. Now you would think you could write cover crop practice up in about 1 paragraph, but really it's about 3 or 4 pages of gobbledygook that sometimes drives people crazy to read, but they're very, very researched, science-based practices. So EQIP was always about practices. And as the name implies, environmental quality incentive, in theory, by adopting these practices, the environment, the quality of the environment is improved. The quality of a watershed could be improved. So that was the original kind of way in which NRCS, when it was first created. I think it was in the early 90s. I was here when EQIP was actually rolled out when I was an early member of the State Technical Committee. Long story about that. And basically it shares in the expense as they define the cost. They get to define how much it costs for instance, to adopt cover crops and develop cover crops on your farm. They get to, NRCS defines that cost through a long procedure that's kind of crazy. And then they say, okay, if you do this, you got to do it this way. And we're going to share the cost of doing that up to, some cases, 75% of that cost. And an ECIP contract with an individual farmer can be as high as $450,000. Now, the big controversy this year from the last farm bill, and we don't like this, a member of the Sustainable Ag Committee don't like it. They have upped the maximum amount for a very particular type of farm that is more corporately structured. They'll allow up to $900,000 contract. Now that usually is over like a 5-year period. That is possible to get. Why we don't like that is there's very limited dollars. And so if you have a $900,000 project, you can eat up a state's allocation of ECIP funds really quick. And so we feel it's not very, plus it's not very means tested. And anyway, that's another whole argument. But interesting, the maximum for organic, if you do it, the ECIP through, or the organic initiative within ECIP, there's lots of sub-initiatives. You're limited to 140,000 with no special cases. Now, I have been arguing about this this year, and I was saying, well, why the hell do you always treat organic? You know, why do they only get 140,000 potential contract? And I was told by somebody who really knows, a guy named Ferd Hefner, who's way more experienced in federal policy than me, said that actually, and I'll search out the history, that the organic movement community, different organizations, actually wanted that limitation. And they wanted that limitation because they were afraid too many people would become organic using these programs, I guess, and thought that they didn't want to give them too many benefits. Anyway, some story like that. I'll have to figure that out. It's probably a very strange history.
Jeff, we got a question here.
Go ahead.
What is the minimum farm ranch size to qualify for these programs?
Any farm can apply for either of these programs. So if you're a legally defined farm, you can apply. There's no size limitation. Now, which will become more clear later. Generally speaking, I would say smaller farms generally benefit more from ECIP than CSP. There's a reason for that. And I'll explain it maybe a little bit later to get too deep in the weeds too fast. Any other questions at this point?
Not anybody else have a question?
Feel free. We got time. I don't have all that many slides for this one. But.
Okay.
Anyway, in the CSP is a much later program. I've been an advocate of this program ever since its beginning. And with Secretary Ann Veneman, if you go back that far, that's around 2000 or something is when it was introduced. It was introduced by a famous senator Senator Harkin from Iowa, one of my favorite senators from Iowa, who actually created this. It used to be called the Conservation Security Program. I've worked on this program for many, many years. And the concept of it is so cool because it's a whole farm perspective. Rather than a practice by practice thing, adoption, what they do is they put several practices together in different arrangements so that you address the whole farm's conservation effort and impact on the environment rather than simply a single adoption of a single practice. So it is a whole farm perspective. You have to have done and you have to meet at what they call a stewardship threshold just to get in, which means you have to have done some, either you're just doing it because you're doing that practice or you actually used ECIP to do it. Doesn't matter. The point is they're going to assess your quote conservation effort to date, and you have to meet a certain minimum to even be eligible. So they used to say CSP is a program that rewards the best and motivates the rest. And that's actually kind of true today. And the rewards are for both maintaining that level of effort. So there's always a cost to maintaining some conservation effort, and also to take on more and higher levels of conservation. So there's two sources of allocations of the funds. That's usually a 5-year contract, 40,000 maximum per year, i.e. 200,000. But again, they got this special case in there again for a potentially over 400,000. There's no separate organic initiative in this case. Although it's interesting to see how organic farmers use it. The one thing I want to stress, and NRCS people will never tell you this, and they'll probably get, if there's an NRCS person on the phone call today on this presentation, they'll probably get angry with me right away for saying this. But I don't care. I'm getting too old and I don't care anymore. This is a competitive program. There's something like about 27,000 farms. Last year, there were 641 ECIP contracts, and there are 85 contracts. You can do the numbers. A small percentage of farms in this state get to utilize these programs. These programs are what they call over-prescribed. There's way more applicants than there is money to give out. So if you want to access this resource, treat it like a grant. You are competing, and you got to learn how to compete for these resources. You know, none of this is, anyway, I'll go to the next slide. These are voluntary programs. No one makes you use any of these programs. They're there for the farmer and rancher in the country to use, and they are competitive. However, if you do use them, you're going to enter into a formal legal contract, which will obligate you to do some things. And a lot of farmers don't use it, these programs, because they simply don't want, they don't mind that they might get some money, but they don't like the contractual obligations. In a sense, they also don't like necessarily to be told how to do something. Good example, you know, a farmer might have learned and done cover cropping. A lot of organic farmers, in fact, most organic farmers compared to non-organic farmers do cover cropping, green manuring, as they call it. And they've done this for years. And then they want to get some resources from NRCS, and NRCS might have little peculiar situations and things about when to terminate the cover crop, da, da, da. And they get, because they get the money, they have to stay within those rules and those obligations, and those are contractual. So they basically will, you know, not give you the money, or I don't know if they can actually come and take it back away from you, or I don't know how that works. But the point is, you know, you got to follow some rules, and you may not want to. So you might say, screw it, I'm not going to take the money because I don't want the obligation. But it is money. And I know many farmers and organic farmers who have helped subsidize their farms and expand their farms utilizing these programs. But they're also very good at it, and they know how to compete. Unfortunately, in this state, for some crazy reason, I'm not going to, gets me angry even to think about it, the deadline for getting money for fiscal year 21, which has already started, that starts October 1st, federal calendar is different than the academic calendar. Our state, NRCS, has set the deadline, was set for November 17th, meaning that if you didn't apply before November 17th, you can't get evaluated and get any money for the entire fiscal year. And I have been angry about this for forever. I think they should do it maybe 2 sign-up periods. They should certainly make the date later into January, because farmers tend to do things like this in the winter. But there's a whole bunch of reasons that I won't bore you with, but I don't think they're very good ones. But that's the way it is. What this means that for both these programs, though, you can still go in tomorrow and sign up for either the CSP or the EQIP program. The problem is your application will be held until next fiscal year, past the next, so hopefully they'll use the same date. So let's say it's November 17th next year. On November 18th, they'll start evaluating your contract. So you can apply continuously. They're always impressed with that, but you got to wait a really long time if you do it tomorrow before you're even considered for funding. So this date is very important. You got to ask your local office about when the date is. They promised me next year that it'll be the same date, but they promised that many times and they don't always follow through. But knowing that date is important because you want to get your application in and not have to wait a whole other year. There's a lot of jargon in NRCS. Use a tremendous amount of acronyms. It drives me crazy. It drives everybody crazy. But again, to be competitive, you got to learn the jargon. You got to speak NRCS speak, because if you come in knowing NRCS speak, they will be very impressed with you, because they think, wow, this guy knows something about this stuff, and that will actually help you, I would argue. So the other thing is that they have all this way they divide agriculture up. And one of the main things is land uses. So all of these programs can vary by whether you're talking about cropland, forest land, pasture land, or range land. And many people don't know that actually forest land is also part of these programs. That's just something people don't really know. But if you're a forest owner, you can also access some of these programs. It's not too competitive in the state to do forest projects, but it's possible. But anything, they divide the practices, because doing conservation on a range, doing conservation of crops in the forest are very different, even if they might be the same, some similar practice. There's this other thing which we'll get into, the resources of concern. These are categories. And the basic ones were soil, water, air, plant, animals, and energy. Actually, energy was added in the last 5 years. They didn't think energy was a resource until recently, which I thought was kind of crazy. But those are like the really big high-level ones. Now they've actually come up with 47 different subcategories that you will see will drive you crazy to understand what they mean. Even though some of them are more thing. And they have this new tool, which I'll talk about, called the Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool, which is embedded with all these things. Another thing that's really important is the stewardship threshold for CSP. That's another jargonistic thing, just means the basic level of stewardship that you practice to be eligible for particularly the CSP. All of these now are embedded in a tool. Well, this is hot off the press from the State Technical Committee meeting. I know it's very big, and we'll come, I'll refer to this a little bit later, but the yellow is these are different kinds of practices that were funded through ECIP in 2019 and 2020. And the yellow is 2019, the blue is 2020. What really bugs me about this, if you go around it, a lot of these are more structural in nature, like fence. I mean, literally, you can get support to put fencing up. And that's a very structural thing. And I'm not saying that fencing and doing cross paddocks and all those things aren't necessarily useful for conservation, but one that always bugs me the most is this is livestock pipeline, conveying water so that you can get better dispersion of cattle. They spend a tremendous amount of your taxpayer dollars on PVC pipe in the state of Montana. It's actually amazing how much to convey water. You get these things like pumping plants. You also notice a lot of these things are livestock oriented. There are some, there's cover crops, and it's nice to see cover crops went up in terms of the things they funded. But so many of these are structural in nature and not really about managing the farm. Nutrient management is there, you can see in a kind of a little bit. But the big ones are these structural ones like livestock pipeline, forest stand, of course, that's in the forest area. Anyway, it's kind of interesting to see how these change over time. So the assistance for ECIP is a share of an estimated cost. Again, they make the estimate. And I just ran through a quick one of organic and non-organic. For basically, these first two are cover crop, adaptive management, cover crop for historically underserved. So you get a little bit more if you're historically underserved. There's a whole definition about low income beginning, socially disadvantaged. I won't go into that, but obviously they try to get a greater benefit for some of those that have been historically underserved by these programs. So you can see that's a slightly higher amount if you're historically underserved. That's actually to kind of write the plan and monitor the plan of doing cover crop during your contract. So that's like a one-time fee. That's why it's called number in red. The other ones are per acre. Basically, they're saying so the cover crop basic, organic and non-organic, they're going to pay you $51, but they're going to pay the total expectation of the cost of adopting cover crop is $51.54. They are going to pay up to 75% of that $51.54, and you're going to have to pay the balance. So that's another thing with this. This is not a free total ride. You have financial obligation to meet the cost of adopting the practice, even if 75% of it is paid by taxpayers. So, you know, and again, this is historically underserved. It's a little bit, there's some other, these seem to be repetitive. I think these have to do with, it's a very complicated sheet, but basically, well, there's a multi-species. So if you're going to mix your cover crops with a bunch of things, that changes it a little bit. Again, historically, I'm not quite sure what this other basic one is, but slightly higher. No, it's the same. So anyway, that just gives you a sense. And there's a list for every single practice. They estimate the cost of adoption and you get a percentage of it. So it's a fundamental way it works. So within the organic world, they did create, and I forget what farm bill it was, they created an organic initiative, which was a really good thing because it was saying, you know, organics, they look like kind of good conservationists. I think we should support that a little bit. So we're going to make a special initiative. And really what that does in the big picture is it takes you out of competing with all non-organic farmers. You know, remember there was a limitation of 140,000 till the next farm bill, total contract you can get on equip. So you don't get as much as potentially other non-organic farms, but you're only competing against other organic farms, which is an extreme competitive advantage. Because if you're competing with all those other guys, as we saw, there's a limitation of funds. You know, it's nice to be in a different pool, they call it, another competitive pool. So if you're an organic farmer, your odds are greater to access equip than if you were just a non-organic farm through this special program. And the funds are set aside separately for this initiative. Now, with every good thing, there's some little strings attached, and these are some of them. For organic production, these are some things that they put in there. They want the soil conditioning index and they want to see that the final crop will be positive to this prediction model. Now, I think they put that in there because I think they have a bias that assumes that our organic farmers till too much, and therefore they're going to be erosive in nature. And they don't want to let them continue that bad erosive behavior. I don't think that's actually true, but they kind of think that way. So they, you know, they put that little thing like, you better not do some crazy too much tillage if you're going to get money for equip. For organic reduction, will the soil event be less than equal to T? T is soil to T equation is basically a tolerance level for soil loss. It's very strange, but NRCS says we can tolerate some soil loss, but not greater than T, which is some kind of predictive model to limit erosion. So again, they're worried about this erosion possibilities on these organic farms. Not, you know, as if non-organic farms don't do erosion issues, don't have erosion issues. Anyway, for organic reduction, will plant productivity and vigor of the crop be maintained with editing? So they're basically also thinking, oh, these guys are doing fertility right. So we got to watch them, you know. They might be under fertilizing their crops for some reason. Then they have a livestock. They're afraid they're going to just not control the invasive weeds because they're organic, right? These are kind of crazy things they put in there, but you know, I really I kind of resent these things because it's kind of the assumption that all organic farms are doing lousy practices. You know, they will use prescribed grazing. They make everybody that, whether they're non-organic or organic. And prescribed grazing is this huge practice standard, which has good and bad elements to it. Now, something really new in Montana with our new state conservationist who came here a couple of years ago. He's really into this local control idea. And so he instituted a program called Montana Focused Conservation. And he wants counties to create what they call targeted implementation plans. And now he's begun allocating about 41% of those limited dollars are now only being allocated through these competitive counties compete against other counties to say, hey, we got this, we're gonna get all our farmers in this county to work on this issue. we're going to get together. They're all going to have individual contracts, but give us money to deal with this issue on the county. Now, there's good sides to that. Of course, if everybody's participating in a county and they come up with a great plan and they can all kind of work together, and and the idea is, well, those local people know what's best to improve the conservation in that county. So, let them do it. Now, of course, my counter argument, well, is everybody really participating? And I'll ask you guys later, maybe you don't get that engaged, but I want to know if you know this exists, if you've ever been part of what they call your local working group, or public open meetings, and whether you've been engaged with your local conservation district in your county to develop one of these TIP plans. I think almost every county has now developed one because they know this is a way to access resources that's new and different. This is very unique to Montana. There's a couple states that play with something like this, but I think that this is a whole new approach, and there's good and bads, but I'm a little bit weary of it. Any questions now before I get into CSP? That's pretty much ECIP.
Feel free to either ask them on your mic, or you can text them too if you prefer.
You're a cow mooing.
Yeah.
That must be out in Glasgow. All right. I know this acronyms. Another CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program. They also use practices, the same practices. They're not unique practice to CSP versus ECIP. So they can be part. You can put a blend together a bunch of practices. They have these things called enhancements, which are kind of like a practice on steroids or something. It's like a little bit higher, a little bit more complicated level of things. And they have these things called bundles, where they bundle a lot of like livestock practices together or certain cropping practices together. And you can kind of get your money allocated based on different kinds of bundles. So there's just a huge list of different kinds of combinations for CSP to put together. But remember, this is whole farm. So you're putting together a whole bunch of different practices into a system that's going to work for you. And you can kind of pick and choose between them all and try to, do the kind of things you want to do. So if you really wanted to maybe try diversified cover crops, or you wanted to take to strip tillage, or you wanted to try some experiment and you wanted to kind of advance, what might be more conservation beneficial, or something you were going to do anyway, but you can get paid for doing it anyway, and you can help with the risk involved in perhaps changing something that you're doing now or something you want to do, particularly like if, for instance, if you're transitioning to organic and where you'd have to learn how to do maybe more complex rotations, or maybe really learn how to do cover cropping, which is not an easy thing to do in dryland farming in Montana. Believe me, people, it takes years to get really good at that. Now, know your priority resources of concern. This is particularly important to access the CSP program. Again, being competitive. These are the current priority resources of concern for this fiscal year, which you can't apply to because it's too late. But anyway, it might be the same next year. Theoretically, state technical community is supposed to be asked whether these are good for the state of Montana. We never were engaged in that conversation. I don't know why. We had a transition of state conservationists. They never asked us, they just picked them. If this was motivated by any local input or not. Anyway, these are what they chose. Why these are important, and they don't make real clear sense to you, just some of them. Like soil quality limitations, terrestrial habitat has to do with wildlife, so that's really more the, riparian and the ranching area. Wind and water erosion seems pretty clear. Degraded plant condition is a fairly high level. I had to look it up because it's a priority of concern, and a lot of times they pick these to be fairly large so it incorporates things like excessive plant pressure, which to me is plant pressure meaning weeds if you're in a cropland situation. Inadequate structure and composition of the plants that are in there, that's more like a range or pasture situation. You want the right forbs and kind of things, forms, legumes, and I'm not a great pasture guy. There's one more in there. Grasses, of course, grasses, forbs. The combination of those in a pasture. So that would be kind of a resource concern. Undesirable plant health and productivity may have to do with nutrient management. So all of that is kind of in that degraded plant condition. So it's kind of nice that they're even wildlife, excessive biomass. So if you get fire issues in forests, that could be under the degraded plant condition. Livestock production limitation. Again, it's a livestock oriented thing. So you can see later, when I was saying how a lot of those things tend to be livestock, well, it comes back to these resources of concern, because these become the priorities. If you are doing some conservation, if you're making applications for a CSA and you're doing something to address the priority resource of concern, your application is going to go right closer to the top. So if you don't want to do anything with degraded plant condition and you want to do something else, you can try to apply for a CSP, but if it doesn't touch onto any of these major resources of concern, your application is going to fall to the bottom. It's kind of like a grant. When the grant says, we want to give money for these things, and you say, well, I want to do these things, well, they'll say, well, we're not getting money for those things. So sorry, I think those are good things, but we have decided in our omnipotence that these are the important ones, and therefore they're embedded in the tool, and they will make or break whether you can do it. So, to be strategic, if you really want to ask it, that's $40,000 a year for 5 years. No shake a stick at money. If you want to really access this program, and there are things within this that kind of can fit in there. You want to look at those, and you want to highlight those, and you want to make those things to be the thing if you want to be competitive for the application. Again, NRCS hates me for probably saying this, but I think if you want to access resources, you want to do conservation, and they're going to make the limitations such that it is, try to fit the best you can within the context of what's available. And that livestock production includes feed and forage imbalance. That's a range pasture issue. Actually, livestock shelters comes under that production limitations. And here's the big one: inadequate livestock water quantity, quality, and distribution. Remember all those pipes running around, conveying water and quality and quantity. That's why that priority resource concern. Why we're seeing again some of these things coming out, because they are embedded in these priority resources of concern. So, come and join a state technical committee. I mean, they're open to public. You can listen in and say, I don't, what are these? Why are we doing those? Or work with your local working group, conservation district, your local NRCS office, get engaged in those target and implementation plans. Make sure that your voice is heard. Make sure that your resources of concern get somehow thrown up the chain of command.
Yeah, I'm going to put a shout out here too. Please let me know too. We work with several different organizations that always want to know if you really like something and it's working for you, or if it's not working and why it's not working. And those things, we belong to organizations like the National Sustainable Ag Coalition that have a really direct routes in Washington, D.C. So your voice is amplified.
Any questions now? Because I'm getting closer to the end, but if this is making sense to you. You'll all be experts, so teach your, share the knowledge. I have to do this one by one with farmers a lot. The reason I have question marks there is that for some reason that we still can't understand, they're asking us, I think even for this year, to add 3 more priority resources of concern. I haven't seen the email to do that yet. So they're actually engaging at least the state technical committee to say what's 3 more, which is good, because then we can add some things that will make this more open to maybe some other things that aren't being handled as well. So that's to be determined. Anyway, the CSP is, like I said, incredibly competitive, way oversubscribed. And it comes down ultimately to an assessment of your farm level of your current resources, looking at what you want to do within the context of those priority resources of concern, and then they kind of run it through a tool called CART now, which is brand new, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But when it comes down to it, they're going to rate you on these, your planned activities, what you're going to do in the future, what level of vulnerability, say you have a highly erosive place, that's going to be part of the, you notice the percentage of the ranking is wide open there. What happens is the state gets to choose the actual number that goes there. And believe it or not, even though it's taxpayer dollars, so far the NRCS won't, from Montana, probably, and it's probably true in most states, they will not tell me what those numbers are. They only will tell me those ranges. They won't tell me what the exact numbers are. You know why? They tell me because if you know those numbers, Jeff, you could tell farmers those numbers. And if those farmers knew those numbers, they could get a higher ranking. And therefore, they could do what? They could do conservation. Isn't that horrible? They could actually win a contract, and they could actually have to do conservation. So we're not going to tell them that because we want them to be in the dark, and so they don't know what those are. So they won't tell me what those actual numbers are. But if your planned activity is 50% of your ranking, and you're only going to continue doing what you're doing, you're not going to do too much more. And let's say it was set at 50%, your ranking is going to be fairly low. Now, if you loaded it up with a bunch of new stuff and you're not going to do too much maintenance, then you're going to do well if it was 50%. But I don't know if 35 or 50. And again, there's the resource priorities. Did you address those resource priorities of concern? That can be up to 35% of your ranking. So you better know what those resources of concern are. And you better, if you really want to access this funding within the context of those limitations, you better kind of stress those resources of concern. And then there's this program priorities, which is just kind of saying like, well, what we think is important is NRCS. And this efficiency score has to do with whether it's kind of cost effective kind of change. So it doesn't make a huge amount, but the planned activities, the resource priorities, program priorities, those really matter. And unfortunately, I can't tell you what they are in the state of Montana, probably any other one in the United States. Know your pools. They also divided the state up into these pools, these pink, green things. And what that means is that they actually, kind of like the ECIP initiative, organic initiative, where they take a pool and they set it aside for organic growers. What they do is they basically do the ranking within each pool. Now, theoretically, I think each pool could slightly change the prioritization within each pool, to address that pool's resources of concern and the weighting of the ranking. I'm not exactly sure they can do that, but anyway, you're basically, if you file for CSP in the yellow area, you're only competing against other yellow area farmers, not the whole state. So knowing what pool you're in and what might there be differences, and something you can ask at your local office. So, well, I'm in this yellow pool, and do we have any specific resources of concern that are important in this pool that have been defined by NRCS, and is it likely that you're going to rank certain things higher than other things if I'm in this yellow pool? So kind of knowing that fact is kind of important. And I have this wonderful set of webinars that if you can't sleep at night, you can start playing them and they'll put you to sleep. No, this is a very impressive tool that I kind of like. It's called the Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool. It's actually really cool. It does all these things, and there's a 3-part webinar series. And if you're going to be competitive, it might be worth at least doing a couple of them. Some of it gets pretty hairy and weedy, but it does really cool things. It can take maps of your farm. It can say how erosive you are. It can do all these kind of cool analysis of, it'll give you a really cool idea of like what conservation effort has been done or likely to be done, or what risk you have, your site vulnerability. It'll do all that kind of stuff. It will not only rank you for a CSP, it will show you what kind of, there are all kinds of special ECIP initiatives and other things. It will basically say, well, you don't look like a good candidate for CSP, but for this ECIP and for these practices, these might be the ones to go for. they'll generate, or for the CSP, they're supposed to, although this is brand new, this is the first year they've fully implemented this. They should, if you apply for CSP this year, if you're already engaged in getting a contract set up, they will publish this nice report. It will tell you why you didn't get funded, why you were ranked where you ranked. It should make it much more transparent, and rather than just saying, well, you didn't make it, Joe, sorry. We gave the money away to some other people in this pool in this region, but you didn't make it. That's kind of what you did in the past. You just didn't make it. Sorry, Joe. Not much more of an explanation. Now you should be able to get and demand feedback that will be quite elaborate in showing exactly why others outcompeted you in this. And again, NCS hates me for saying it that way, but too bad. Okay, I'm done. Take home. It's a competition. If you want to access these, and this is a lot of money every year, you want to access it, and you want to do good things on your farm. I know farms who have, like I said, have partly subsidized their farm on the basis. CSP, in many cases, some of the things that organic farmers are doing are already good conservation. They generally meet the stewardship threshold. They generally are doing things above the threshold. Sometimes they can keep doing the same things, or they can even do a little bit more. So they're very good candidates for CSP if they know what they're doing and they do things in the context of what I just explained to you. And really work with your local NRCS. There are some good folks, there's some bad folks. It's like everybody else, they're all human beings. They are worked too hard and they're not paid enough. I will agree with that. And writing up a CSP contract involves a lot more energy than an EQIP. So they tend to like EQIP and they hate CSP because it's a lot more work for them, but bear with them. They're there to help you and they generally are. But be persistent, ask questions, don't be meek. This is taxpayer dollars. This is money that many of us in the sustainable ag movement and organic movement have fought for so that these resources are available to you. And I hate it when they're not being used well. So I believe organic farmers can really access and they can really use this well. And so go after it if you really want to do it. They'll also try to do this. They always love, NRCS loves to do planning. And I'm not against planning, but there's an extent to which I go a little bit crazy. But they'll usually what they'll do is you'll go and say, hey, I want to sign up for this CSP program. And they'll say, have you done a plan? No, well, we can help you do a plan. Maybe you want to do a plan first, and they'll take you through 6 months of planning activities, and you'll never get back to the CSP program. Or maybe you will eventually. I'm not saying it's all bad to plan. It's just, there's a certain, you want to access resources. You kind of understand what the program is. And doing a plan doesn't hurt. So you can usually put that into a contract anyway. So, and plans are nice. I'm not saying that, but sometimes I get a little over carried away with planning. CART should provide a report, as I said, and the early intimations I've heard from some people, they're not doing that. And I've even heard that many offices don't even know how to use the tool yet. It is complicated. I don't blame them. They're still learning. Participate in your county work groups. They're supposed to be like regular scheduled public meetings once a month. They're usually associated with your conservation district. The NRCS office ought to know. They ought to encourage you to participate. That's where you can use that 41% of EQIP dollars and help folks in your county work together and be part of that. And I stress that organic farmers should be part of that. And they should getting their voice heard just as well as non-organic in those. And because we're doing this crazy way with these tip plans and logo-led stuff, if you want to see these resources serve you, you gotta speak up and you gotta be a squeaky wheel. And if you ever have any problems, call me. I love to investigate problems with conservation programs, but always go up the chain. The state conservation, who is the god of all NRCS programs in Montana, the Montana state conservationist, he's the head, he makes all these big decisions. You can email him. You got a problem, email him. I mean, don't go right away and bother him too much. That's not a good idea, although I bother him too much already. Anyway, the problem is, you don't just take no verbatim. Or if they're not answering your question correctly, move up the chain. And again, these are voluntary. Nobody's making you do these things. They're your option. So if you get into this, and you don't like what they're trying to make you do or not do, you don't have to access them. And we got great publications on our website. I'm always available, Jeff S. at NCAT.org. You can find my phone number somewhere there too. I'm in my office at home all the time now. And I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, we've got some questions here. Rich asks, can you give us a few examples of funded projects? For example, size, scope, funding label, and a success story or two.
For equippers, equip, I can look out my window and show you an example. We have a kind of a demonstration farm in the back of our building here in Butte, Montana, of all places. Craziest place to grow vegetables in the world, I think. But we're doing it under something called high tunnels, which are really just greenhouses that are kind of movable. I don't quite ever understand what a high tunnel is, other than kind of fancy greenhouse. Anyway, they have equip dollars available. They actually have a special high tunnel initiative, so you get in a different pool. Anyway, we access those programs. We have 2 operating high tunnels. 75% of the cost was paid by, thank you, taxpayers. And we now have a great demonstration farm showing how you can grow vegetables even in Butte. That's one equip program. And a lot of people, vegetable producers particularly, have used, the high tunnel has been used very widely. It's a very successful program. There's been arguments about what the conservation benefit of a high tunnel is, but we won't go there exactly. But there's some issues about that debate. But another thing would be just cover cropping. There's this is not true so much of organic, but a lot of non-organic farmers don't cover crop. Cover cropping is very limited in this state, and it's very difficult to do. But this can ease the cost of trying it. If you need to convey water or pump water to your livestock, it seems like that's a priority resource concern. You're likely to get money, and it seems we're spending money on things like that. So if you're in that boat, here's a good one. CSP is a little harder to say. My best example is Doug Crabtree, who's a member of MOA, you might know. He basically, I've watched his farm from when he left, working for the Montana certification program, started his farm, and I helped him through utilizing these programs, particularly the CSP. I mean, that's $40,000 a year for 5 years. He's done it twice. That means he's probably gotten close to $400,000 to implement things that he's likely we're going to implement. He has these pollinator-friendly strip habitat things, very unique farm. He's incorporated that into CSP. He's trying to do it with integrating livestock into his operation now. CSP is a little bit complicated because it's whole farm and it involves a lot of things, but a lot of the practices that different kinds of weed control, nutrient management, compost facilities, creating compost. There are a lot of different ways you can put together some practices and some actual things into a CSP contract, being competitive again, and do it. So it's not really a simple one to give you an example of, but nonetheless, it has been utilized in a very good way to really enhance and build some pretty interesting and kind of cutting edge farms out there. And many of them have been organic farms, because I do believe organic farming is on the kind of the cutting edge of, people say it's old technology or no technology. I think organic farms are some of the most technologically and innovative farms in the country. And I've seen that done. And not to say that there aren't some goofball ones too, but generally speaking, and so it's a very good program for organic in particular, or anyone who wants to try, innovative practices that, are a little bit outside the norm. Is that good? Example? Any other questions?
Is there a minimum funding request? Would a $5,000 application on 1 acre be acceptable?
Well, it depends again on what program you're talking about. I mean, a high tunnel costs more than $5,000. So yeah, and then we have way less than an acre out here, maybe about an acre, and we got funding. So again, it's not, there's no minimum or maximum. It depends on what you're doing. A high tunnel costs X, and you get 75% of it cost shared. And for instance, there's a practice called compost facility. you want to build a facility to do composting on your farm, for the infrastructure, like the bins or whatever, and you can get funding to do that, and that's hardly any acreage at all. So it's here's where it gets tricky. Some of the practices you see are on a per acreage basis. So if I'm on a little 3-acre vegetable, which isn't little for a vegetable horticulture operation, I got 3 acres, and I'm going to try cover crops. And then what was it, $50 an acre? Well, that's 3 times 50, that's $150 to try cover crops on your little small farm. It's like, well, is it worth the paperwork for that? But so there's this tendency for it to, even though they say all these things are scale neutral, there isn't. CSP does have an actual minimum, I believe right now, and it's kind of changing, but it was $1,500. So even a small farm could apply, and this has actually happened, for a CSP contract. And even if the funding doesn't measure up to more than under $1,500, they will still get the minimum $1,500, to basically over 5 years. So that's 5 times 1,500. It is CSP, unfortunately, because cost is all based on this per acreage type of calculation. The more acres it goes across, the larger the kind of the benefit. So the smaller farms just tendency, and horticulture operators tend not to use CSP, but they do use ECIP quite a bit. That's an inherent bad bias in my opinion. So even though they say they're scale neutral, I don't really think the reality is that they are scale neutral programs per se. And we're trying to always, in our fights during farm bills, to up that minimum so that more smaller farms could use CSP. The kind of argument, the argument that philosophically here is that, well, if I get good cover crop practice on a 10,000 acre farm, that's a hell of a lot of conservation. So I'm going to pay a lot of money for that because I get over 10,000 acres one shot. Whereas how many little farms would I have to give, $1,500 CSP contracts to meet the equivalent of that one 10,000 acre farm? And the idea is to get more conservation on the land. So there's this bias. A lot of little lights doing a lot of good, or a few big guys doing a lot of big things, making a lot of difference. It's a philosophical, ethical issue about what's the best way to do it. Does that help? Any others? Hello, did I lose everybody?
No, yeah, I'm here. I'm thinking it would be interesting to get, maybe a session together with MOA folks who are using these programs and share those stories.
Yeah. Doug can tell all kinds of stories. He's had, like I say, he's had now over 10 years, and I think he applied this year again. I'm not sure if he got renewed or not. So he could, 10 years of experience, and there were some bad times and good times. Done a lot of good, but there was some real battles about, again, what's the correct way to do a cover crop. That's particularly one that could get really hairy very fast and get people kind of steamed. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. I don't know in our membership how many people have actually, I keep using Doug because I know him so well and I've told the story for so long, but I really need to branch out. I've actually interviewed other farmers around the country and some other even MOA members that have used CSP in the past. So it's they're not the only ones. But yeah, I don't even know, Jamie, if you were asked a survey question, how many people have used either ECIP or CSP as organic farmers? It'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, I mean, some people don't like to share the information, but
yeah, because they're taking that government money, like as if that's
no
one isn't, but I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a philosophical thing, and I don't, they're voluntary.
Yeah.
It's people's choice, but we work really hard to provide these things, and I like to see them used well rather than poorly. And you need the voices there to make sure they are used well. And believe me, there's many battles I fought over 20-some years.
Squeaky wheels.
About using, I get a lot of, I think I've made myself a pain in the ass to every state conservationist since I've been on the state network. So, And I'm notorious for it. I don't care. It's a reputation I like.
Well, thank you very much for providing your very informative session that, you know, it's almost like putting money in the bank.
Yeah.
So.
I wish that was easy. I wish it wasn't as competitive. I wish that the money is,